The story of modern Indochina begins not with a bang, but with a weary sigh. For nearly a century, France had ruled over the lands we now know as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This was a time of exploitation. Local resources were extracted for French profit. Local cultures were suppressed. But by the mid-20th century, the spirit of independence was stirring across the globe. In Vietnam, a charismatic and determined leader named Ho Chi Minh had been fighting for his country's freedom for decades. His nationalist movement, the Viet Minh, saw an opportunity after World War II. They believed their time had finally come. The French, however, were not ready to let go of their prized colonial possession. The inevitable clash came in the form of the First Indochina War. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that lasted for 8 long years. The French military, confident in its superior technology and training, found itself bogged down in a guerrilla war it could not win. The Viet Minh, fighting on their home soil, knew the jungles and the mountains. They had the support of the people. The final decisive battle took place in 1954 at a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu. Against all odds, the Viet Minh surrounded the French garrison and, after a grueling 56-day siege, forced its surrender. The defeat was a profound shock to France and a signal to the world that the age of European colonialism was coming to an end. With the French military defeated, international powers gathered in Geneva, Switzerland, to decide the future of Indochina. The Geneva Accords of 1954 were meant to bring peace and stability. They formally granted independence to Laos and Cambodia. For Vietnam, the solution was more complicated. The country was to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh would control the north. A non-communist, Western-backed government would control the south. This division was never intended to be permanent. The accords explicitly called for a nationwide election in 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. It was a plan that seemed reasonable on paper, a compromise to end the bloodshed, but this peace was built on a foundation of sand. The world was now locked in a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. It was a global struggle between two superpowers with opposing ideologies. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, saw Ho Chi Minh not as a nationalist, but as a puppet of the Soviet Union and China. They believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow like a row of falling dominoes. This domino theory would come to dominate American foreign policy. The promise of a unifying election in Vietnam was a direct threat to this policy, because everyone knew Ho Chi Minh would win in a landslide. A fragile peace was about to be sacrificed for a global power struggle. The temporary division of Vietnam quickly hardened into a permanent reality. In the north, Ho Chi Minh established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a socialist state with its capital in Hanoi. He was a hero to many Vietnamese for defeating the French. He began consolidating power and implementing land reform programs. In the south, the United States threw its support behind a staunchly anti-communist nationalist named Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem established the Republic of Vietnam with its capital in Saigon. He was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, and his government was soon plagued by corruption and nepotism. The United States, desperate for a stable ally, overlooked these flaws. The nationwide election promised for 1956 never happened. President Diem, with the full backing of the United States, refused to participate. He knew, as did the Americans, that he stood no chance of winning against the popular Ho Chi Minh. This cancellation was a pivotal moment. It destroyed the hope for a peaceful reunification that had been outlined in the Geneva Accords. For the communists in the north, and for their many sympathizers in the south, it was a clear sign that their goal of a unified Vietnam could only be achieved through armed struggle. The temporary ceasefire line at the 17th parallel became a fortified border, a stark symbol of a nation torn in two by outside forces. In the late 1950s, a low-level insurgency began to bubble up in South Vietnam. Former Viet Minh fighters who had stayed in the South, along with others who were disgusted by Diem's oppressive rule, began to organize. In 1960, Hanoi formally sanctioned the creation of the National Liberation Front, which the Diem government and the United States would label the Viet Cong. This was the beginning of the Second Indochina War, known in America as the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, striking at government outposts and officials, then melting back into the villages and jungles. They were supplied with weapons and guidance from North Vietnam, which sent supplies down a network of trails through Laos and Cambodia known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The United States responded by increasing its support for Diem's government. They sent money, weapons, and a growing number of military advisors to train the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN. The strategy was to help the South defend itself, but Diem's government was failing. His strategic Hamlet program, which forcibly relocated peasants into fortified villages to isolate them from the Viet Cong, only created more resentment. His persecution of the country's Buddhist majority led to widespread protests, including the shocking self-immolation of several monks, images of which were broadcast around the world. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Washington felt it was losing its grip. By late 1963, the Kennedy administration had lost faith in Ngo Dinh Diem. He was seen as an obstacle to winning the war. With tacit American approval, a group of South Vietnamese generals launched a coup and assassinated Diem. This act, meant to stabilize the situation, only deepened the chaos. A series of unstable military governments followed in Saigon, none of which could command the loyalty of the people. The Viet Cong insurgency grew stronger, and the South Vietnamese army was on the brink of collapse. In Washington, a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, believed he had to act decisively. He was not going to be the president who lost Vietnam to communism. The moment for major escalation came in August 1964. An alleged attack on a U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin provided the pretext. The details of the incident were murky, and evidence of a second attack was questionable at best. But it was enough. President Johnson went before Congress and secured the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave him broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. By March 1965, the first U.S. combat troops were landing at Da Nang. What had been a limited advisory role was now an American war. The strategy was to use overwhelming firepower to grind down the enemy until they gave up. The war escalated rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were sent to Vietnam. The United States unleashed a massive bombing campaign, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder, against North Vietnam. On the ground, U.S. forces conducted search and destroy missions, trying to find and eliminate Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units. But the enemy was elusive. They controlled the night. They used tunnels, traps, and ambushes. For American soldiers, it was a war without fronts and without clear objectives. Measuring progress was difficult. The military relied on body counts, a grim metric that often led to the killing of civilians, and created a deep moral ambiguity for the soldiers fighting the war. The turning point came in January 1968 with the Tet Offensive. During a holiday ceasefire, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on cities and towns all across South Vietnam. Militarily, the offensive was a disaster for the communists. They suffered enormous casualties and failed to hold any of their objectives. But psychologically, it was a stunning victory. It shattered the illusion, carefully cultivated by the U.S. government, that the war was being won and that the enemy was on the verge of collapse. Back in the United States, public support for the war plummeted. President Johnson, his credibility destroyed, announced he would not seek re-election. The war would drag on for years, but after Tet, the question was no longer how to win, but how to get out. While the world's attention was fixed on Vietnam, a parallel conflict was unfolding in the quiet, landlocked kingdom of Laos. After the French departure, the Geneva Accords of 1954 had established Laos as an independent and, crucially, neutral nation. Its leader, Prince Suvarnabhumi, tried to steer a middle course, balancing the competing interests of the pro-Western royalists, the neutralists, and the communist-aligned Pathet Lao. The Pathet Lao was a nationalist movement ideologically linked to Ho Chi Minh's government in North Vietnam. For a brief time, it seemed that a delicate peace, maintained through coalition governments, might hold in this gentle, mountainous land. This neutrality, however, was doomed from the start. Laos's geography made it strategically vital to the war next door. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the primary supply route for North Vietnamese troops and equipment heading to South Vietnam, ran directly through the eastern mountains of Laos. For North Vietnam, controlling this corridor was non-negotiable. It was their lifeline. For the United States, severing this lifeline was a top military priority. Both sides began to systematically violate Lao neutrality to achieve their own objectives in Vietnam. The fragile peace in Laos became another casualty of the larger Cold War confrontation. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was tasked with carrying out America's secret war in Laos. They could not send in official U.S. troops without openly violating the Geneva Accords. Instead, the CIA armed, funded, and trained a proxy army. This army was composed largely of ethnic Hmong tribesmen, led by a charismatic general named Vang Pao. The Hmong, a mountain people with a long history of independence, were fiercely anti-communist and had their own grievances with the lowland Lao and the Vietnamese. They became America's secret soldiers, fighting to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail and push back the growing influence of the Pathet Lao and their North Vietnamese allies. What followed was a brutal clandestine war, hidden from the American public and the world. The Royal Laotian Army was often ineffective, leaving the Hmong to do most of the heavy fighting. They were supported by CIA case officers and a covert airline, Air America, which dropped supplies and flew countless combat missions. For years, Vang Pao's forces fought a seesaw battle against the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese army. They fought with incredible bravery, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The war turned large parts of the country into a free fire zone, forcing hundreds of thousands of civilians to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own land. The ground war fought by the CIA's proxy army was only one half of the secret war in Laos. The other half was waged from the air. Beginning in the mid-1960s, the United States unleashed one of the most ferocious aerial bombardments in human history. The primary target was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American bombers, flying from bases in Thailand and from aircraft carriers, flew mission after mission, attempting to choke off the flow of soldiers and supplies into South Vietnam. But the trail was not a single road. It was a complex web of paths, hidden under dense jungle canopy, constantly being repaired and rerouted by thousands of dedicated North Vietnamese workers. The bombing was relentless and indiscriminate. From 1964 to 1973, the United States dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Laos. This is more than all the bombs dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. It works out to a plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 straight years. Laos earned the tragic distinction of being the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. The bombs did not just hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They fell on villages, rice paddies, and ancient temples. The civilian population, especially in the eastern provinces controlled by the Pathet Lao, was forced to live a subterranean existence, hiding in caves and trenches to survive the daily onslaught from the sky. A significant portion of the ordnance dropped on Laos consisted of cluster bombs. These were large canisters that opened in mid-air, releasing hundreds of smaller bomblets that scattered over a wide area. They were designed to kill or maim enemy personnel in the open, but many of these bomblets failed to detonate on impact. They became, in effect, a form of landmine, littering the landscape for decades to come. Long after the war ended, these unexploded ordnance, or UXO, would continue to claim victims. Farmers tilling their fields, children playing, and families collecting scrap metal would stumble upon these deadly relics of a secret war. The secret war in Laos ended in 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords, which officially ended America's involvement in Vietnam, called for a ceasefire in Laos as well. The American bombing stopped. The CIA withdrew its support. Without their American backers, the Hmong army and the Royal Lao government quickly collapsed. In 1975, the Pathet Lao marched into the capital city of Vientiane and took power, establishing the Lao People's Democratic Republic. For the Hmong who had fought for the CIA, it was a time of terror. Tens of thousands were hunted down, imprisoned in so-called re-education camps, or killed. Many more undertook a desperate trek across the Mekong River to seek refuge in Thailand, their alliance with America having cost them everything. Like Laos, Cambodia tried to walk a tightrope of neutrality during the early years of the Vietnam War. Its ruler, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, was a masterful political survivor. He skillfully balanced the pressures from the United States, China, and North Vietnam, hoping to keep his kingdom out of the escalating conflict. Sihanouk allowed the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to use Cambodian ports and border areas as sanctuaries and supply routes. He reasoned that it was better to tolerate their presence than to provoke a direct confrontation with his powerful neighbor. At the same time, he maintained diplomatic relations with the United States. For a while, this delicate balancing act seemed to work, but the war in Vietnam would not be contained. As the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos came under heavier attack, the communist supply lines through Cambodia became even more important. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 on a promise to end the war, believed that destroying these sanctuaries was key to his strategy of Vietnamization, handing the war over to the South Vietnamese. In March 1969, he authorized a secret bombing campaign in Cambodia, codenamed Operation Menu. For 14 months, American B-52s flew thousands of sorties, dropping over 100,000 tons of bombs on suspected communist base camps, all without the knowledge of the American public or Congress. The secret bombing destabilized Cambodia and weakened Prince Sihanouk's grip on power. While Sihanouk was out of the country in March 1970, he was overthrown in a coup led by his pro-American Prime Minister, General Lon Nol. The United States quickly recognized and supported the new regime. Just weeks after the coup, Nixon announced a ground incursion into Cambodia, sending U.S. and South Vietnamese troops across the border to attack the communist sanctuaries. The invasion and the ongoing bombing plunged Cambodia headfirst into civil war. The Cambodian army, loyal to Lon Nol, fought against the North Vietnamese, and a small but growing Cambodian communist insurgency, the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge had existed for years as a marginal political movement, but the chaos of the coup, the American bombing, and the invasion created the perfect conditions for them to thrive. Their mysterious French-educated leader, Saloth Sar, better known as Pol Pot, was a radical ideologue. The Khmer Rouge presented themselves as the only true patriots fighting against Lon Nol's corrupt, American-backed government. The American bombs, which killed tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians, drove countless peasants and angry young recruits into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. A movement that was once insignificant was now growing into a formidable army, setting the stage for an unimaginable tragedy. The Cambodian Civil War was a nightmare. Lon Nol's government was corrupt and incompetent. His army was poorly led and could not stop the advance of the Khmer Rouge. The United States propped up his regime with billions of dollars in aid and a devastating bombing campaign that continued until Congress forced a halt in August 1973. The bombing inflicted immense suffering on the Cambodian countryside and did little to stop the Khmer Rouge. In fact, it served as their most effective recruiting tool. By early 1975, the Khmer Rouge had surrounded the capital city, Phnom Penh, which was swollen with millions of refugees who had fled the fighting and the American bombs. On April 17, 1975, just 2 weeks before the fall of Saigon, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh. Initially, residents greeted them as liberators, hoping the war was finally over, but their hope quickly turned to horror. Within hours, the black-clad soldiers began to forcibly evacuate the entire city, ordering millions of people out into the countryside at gunpoint. This was the beginning of Year Zero, Pol Pot's insane plan to create a purely agrarian communist utopia. Cities were declared evil, money, markets, religion, and education were abolished. Family bonds were broken. The Khmer Rouge sought to erase every trace of the past. The entire population was forced into slave labor in vast collective farms. The new people, the urban dwellers, the educated, the merchants, were singled out for particularly brutal treatment. Anyone suspected of having ties to the old regime, anyone who was educated, anyone who wore glasses, was considered an enemy of the revolution. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion were rampant. The slightest complaint could result in immediate execution. The Khmer Rouge established notorious security prisons, like Tuol Sleng, S21, in Phnom Penh, where thousands were systematically tortured to extract forced confessions before being taken to killing fields, like Choeung Ek, to be murdered. The Khmer Rouge regime, which called itself Democratic Kampuchea, lasted for less than 4 years, from April 1975 to January 1979. In that short time, it caused the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the country's population. This was one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. The reign of terror finally ended when Vietnam, provoked by a series of bloody border raids by the Khmer Rouge, invaded Cambodia in late 1978. They captured Phnom Penh in January 1979, toppling Pol Pot's regime and exposing the full horror of the killing fields to a shocked world. The nightmare of Year Zero was over, but Cambodia's suffering was not. The end of the wars in 1975 did not bring immediate peace or prosperity to Indochina. The region was left shattered, its societies traumatized, and its landscapes poisoned. In Vietnam, the victorious North faced the monumental task of unifying a country that had been at war for 30 years. The economy was in ruins. Millions were dead or wounded. The South was sullen and resentful. The new communist government implemented re-education camps for those associated with the former Saigon regime, imprisoning hundreds of thousands of people for years. The war also left a deadly environmental legacy. Unexploded bombs littered the countryside, and the toxic chemical defoliant Agent Orange sprayed by the U.S. military caused generations of birth defects and cancers. In Laos, the victory of the Pathet Lao led to an exodus of refugees and the establishment of a rigid, isolated communist state. For decades, the country remained one of the poorest in the world. The greatest physical legacy of its secret war is the plague of unexploded ordnance, UXO. Decades after the last bomb fell, these hidden killers continue to maim and kill innocent people every year. The clearance is a slow, dangerous, and expensive process, a deadly inheritance that cripples development and holds the rural population in a state of fear. The Hmong people, who fought for the CIA, paid the heaviest price, facing persecution at home and a difficult life as refugees abroad. For Cambodia, the fall of the Khmer Rouge in 1979 was not the end of the conflict. It was merely the beginning of another chapter. A new civil war erupted, with a Vietnamese-backed government fighting a coalition of resistance forces that tragically included the Khmer Rouge, who were now supported by China, Thailand, and, indirectly, the United States, who saw them as a bulwark against Vietnamese influence. This conflict dragged on for another decade. It was only after the withdrawal of Vietnamese troops and a UN-brokered peace process in the early 1990s that Cambodia could finally begin the long, painful process of rebuilding and seeking justice for the genocide. The psychological trauma of the killing fields still haunts the nation today. Across all three countries, the human cost was immeasurable. Entire generations were lost. Families were torn apart. The wars created a massive refugee crisis, the boat people, as hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled persecution and poverty in rickety, overcrowded boats, many perishing at sea. Laotians and Cambodians streamed into refugee camps in Thailand. The social fabric of these ancient societies had been shredded. The promise of independence from colonial rule had been cruelly betrayed, replaced by decades of war, starvation, and genocide, fueled by the ideological certainty of distant superpowers. Looking back, the tragedy that engulfed Indochina was the product of a perfect storm. It was a collision of two powerful historical forces. The first was the legacy of colonialism. French rule had created artificial borders, exploited resources, and suppressed the natural political development of these societies. When the French were forced out, they left behind a power vacuum and a population with a deep-seated desire for true independence. This created a fragile, volatile environment ripe for conflict. Nationalists like Ho Chi Minh saw their struggle as the final step in throwing off a century of foreign domination. Into this fragile environment stepped the second force, the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, with their allies, saw Southeast Asia not as a collection of unique countries with their own histories and aspirations, but as a chessboard. Every local conflict was interpreted through the global lens of the struggle between communism and capitalism. The domino theory, the American fear that one nation's fall to communism would trigger the collapse of its neighbors, justified intervention on a massive scale. This transformed a localized anti-colonial struggle into an international proxy war. The great powers poured weapons, money, and eventually troops into the region, exacerbating local rivalries and turning civil disagreements into catastrophic wars. The division of Vietnam, a temporary measure that became a 30-year tragedy, was a direct result of Cold War politics. The secret war in Laos was a cynical violation of a small nation's neutrality in service of a larger strategic goal in Vietnam. The destabilization of Cambodia through bombing and a US-backed coup created the conditions for the rise of a genocidal regime. In each case, the interests and well-being of the local people were secondary to the geopolitical ambitions of the superpowers. The story of Indochina from 1954 to 1980 is a profound and cautionary tale. It shows how the dreams of independence that follow the end of colonialism can be warped and destroyed when they become entangled in the conflicts of larger, more powerful nations. The people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia did not choose to be on the front lines of the Cold War. But their geography and the circumstances of their history placed them there. The result was a level of destruction and human suffering that is difficult to comprehend, a tragedy born from the deadly combination of a colonial legacy and ideological fanaticism.